I'm Chance Storland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. And now back from Denver, I'm joined now by the San Antonio Express News sports writer I'm often speaking with, Jeff McDonald. Jeff, great to have you back here. Obviously, this is a special episode. We don't know how many episodes we're going to have left, as is always the issue with covering the postseason of any team, let alone the Spurs this season. So as I just mentioned, you've been traveling. You're just now back from Denver. The Spurs obviously took game one. They lost game two. It's obviously the goal of every underdog in an NBA playoff series to take at least one of the first two games on the road. That has happened. However, it's a little hard not to feel like they left something on the table after blowing a pair of 19-point leads in that most recent game two before losing 114 to 105. They're back in San Antonio for games 3 and 4 of what is now a tied series where they could have been up 2-0. And they really had Denver on the ropes before now being 1-1. So regarding the Spurs' chances of pulling an upset and winning this series, obviously Denver is a number 2 seed. Are we feeling more optimistic or less optimistic, or maybe about the same after one victory, one loss? And do you think that this game 2 victory comeback, did that give this young Nuggets team, which is kind of the opposite of the experience the Spurs bring to the game, did it give the Nuggets new life? What do you say happened after these first two games?
I think if, you'd ask any Spurs fan, any Spurs player, any Spurs coach, anyone affiliated with the Spurs, if you had told them you're going to go to Denver and come back with one victory, I think they would have been happy with that. I mean, coming in, the big thing was when you're the underdog, when you're the lower seeded team, you're going on the road to start an NBA playoff series, you have to win at least one game on the road in order to win the series. That's just the mathematical truth of it. And there was real concern that the Spurs might not be able to pull it off. They had not been a great road team this year. So to go in there and get one win, it sets them up to where now all they have to do is win the home games, and they're free and clear of the Nuggets. If they go into 3 and 4 and win both those games, they're up 3-1, with 3 chances to close it out. That said, as you mentioned, it's hard not to feel like, man, they had Denver right there. Like it almost would have been a knockout blow in game 2 if the Spurs could have held on and won that game when they were up by 19 points in the second quarter, and then lost most of that, and then built it back up, was up by 19 in the third quarter, and still couldn't hold on thanks to a just crazy fourth quarter of shot making from Denver's Jamal Murray. If the Spurs had won that game and gone up 2-0, you're pretty much looking like the series is a done deal. There's only 4 teams in NBA history that have gone down 2-0 at home and gone on to win a best-of-7 series. And I don't think these Nuggets were ready to be the 5th to do that. But now it's 1-1. If you're the Spurs, you're saying, hey, we went to Denver. We got the game we wanted to win. We got the bare minimum. We got what we needed to do. Now, if they come home and take care of business at home, they're back in control. They're really in control of the series again. The Nuggets, I think they were doubting themselves. I mean, they're a young team. Of the 6 of the 9 players that they played in game 1 had never played an NBA playoff game before. That was their debut. And so they get beat in game 1 in a tight game, and then they're getting routed in game 2, can't make anything. If they had not pulled out that game, I think you're looking at the Nuggets really starting to doubt themselves coming to San Antonio, and I think the Spurs could have made short work of them. As it is, I think that is kind of the danger. You've let a young team get some confidence, get its feet under them, and kind of realize that, hey, they belong in this playoff mix too. I think basically what happened in Denver is it's more that the Nuggets, in game 2 especially, it's more that the Nuggets avoided a lethal blow. If the Spurs had won that game, the series is all but over. Now they've lived to fight another day, but the Spurs are still, if you take the bird's eye view of the series, they're still in control until they lose a game at home.
So it's really interesting. Obviously, there was a big difference between game 1 and game 2. You just kind of described what that means. Really what it was, Nuggets guard Jamal Murray, absolutely dreadful the first game. This most recent game 2 started off the same way, and similarly, first 8 shots, nothing coming down, and then he came alive in the fourth quarter. He really keyed to Denver's comeback. 21 of his 24 points in that fourth quarter. They had that big run, I think, over 3 minutes where the Spurs just scored 2 points, something like that. Tell me about what happened there exactly. And do you think this series could really just come down to something as simple as whether Murray makes or misses shots? That seems to have been what happened in game two.
Yeah, I have never seen a player, those first 7 quarters Murray played in Denver, I've never seen a player look more rattled, more shaken up, more just not ready for the playoff moment than Jamal Murray in those first 7 quarters in Denver. And he was one of the guys I mentioned that was making his playoff debut, had never been on that stage before. And it showed. I mean, he not only could he not make shots, he was 8 of 23 in game one, missed just a wide open look that could have possibly won game one for Denver there down the stretch. Really seemed like he was in his own head. The talk between game one and two is he's going to be better. He's going to, he's not going to dwell on the past. He's going to move forward, blah, blah, blah. And then he opens game two just firing up more bricks and just making bad decisions, getting blocked at the rim. He missed a dunk. At least you think you make your dunks, but he missed the dunk early. Starts 0-8 and just looks like he's going to go in the tank, and that's the end of the Nuggets season, basically, if that happens. And, give him credit. Jamal Murray stuck with it and showed why he is one of the better scorers in the NBA. And there in the fourth quarter, he had basically a whole game's worth of scoring crammed into one fourth quarter, made his first 8 shots. And it's kind of interesting symmetry. He starts missing his first 8 shots and then opens the fourth quarter when the Nuggets need him to rescue them. Makes his first 8 shots. And, some of them were open and some of them were just circus shots and well guarded, and Derek White's all over him. And he's just one of those players that if he gets hot, it really doesn't matter how tightly you defend him, he can still make those shots. And so to answer the second part of your question, we tend to break down these series matchup by matchup, and Spurs need to do this, the Nuggets need to do that, and pace and rebounding and blah, 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 blah. But really, sometimes it comes down to, do the guys you have on your team who can make crazy shots, do they make those crazy shots? And it might just come down to, for the Spurs, does Jamal Murray make shots in a game or does he miss shots in a game? And that really determines your fortune. And it almost seems almost helpless in a way. There are certain things you can do to try to prevent him from going crazy. You can try to make it hard on him, but it's almost sort of helpless that even if you do those things, he can maybe make those shots anyway. And so I think the Spurs will do their best to, defend him as best they can. I don't know if you can do things to take the ball out of his hands because you're really focusing all your defensive energies on Nikola Jokic. You're trying to get the ball out of his hands. I mean, somebody's gonna have one-on-one coverage, and the Spurs are gonna let Jamal Murray do that, it seems, for now. So it's just a matter of if he's been missing wide open shots and making just shots with inside his jersey. So it's just kind of, the series seems like it's going to go with however this mercurial guard shoots, and it's horrifying to watch if you're a Spurs fan because you really don't know what's going to happen. But I mean, he's a good scorer. He had a 48-point game this year. He had a 46-point game this year. When he gets hot, Jamal Murray is one of the hardest to defend players in the NBA. He's not a guy that I think a lot of casual fans might know. He's not an all-star. He's not LeBron James. But he's a very good NBA scorer. He's one of those guys that if he gets hot, he can really hurt you no matter what you do against him. And it's going to be interesting to see where it goes from here. And it's going to be interesting to see if that fourth quarter carries over to game 3. If now that he has his confidence and his legs under him, if he's that guy if he's closer to that guy than he was to the guy who basically looked like those first 7 quarters were the NBA. Those are the first 7 quarters of basketball he'd ever played in his life. I don't think that's him. So Spurs are going to just have to weather whatever he throws at them, I think.
Jeff, I love the way you described that. How was the postseason this year? Oh, it was horrible. It's terrifying to watch that. Wow, you're honest, man. I love that on having you on the program for that reason. We'll get back to Jokic here in a second, but you mentioned Derek White. He's the point guard counterpart on the Spurs of Murray. He also had his first two playoff starts of his career in games 1 and 2. But despite that postseason inexperience, in many ways, he's been the Spurs' steadiest player throughout the series. He's also been such a huge component of, I think maybe if I gave it some time, like the second half of the Spurs season coming up all the time here on the Spurs Insider. Are you surprised at all at White's performances so far? As I just, mentioned here, kind of par for the course for what we've seen for such a long time this season.
Yeah, I think, he has been a really steady, poised. That's kind of his deal. He's a steady, poised player, plays with great pace and great purpose, and kind of with a poise even that belies his age. I mean, this is really his first season of playing, meaningful minutes. But I think there was always a question, as there is with any player that has never really performed on the playoff stage before. What are they going to, what are they going to do when the lights go up bigger, when it's the playoffs, when the whole world is watching? And Derek White's been pretty much the same guy, and I think that's been a pleasant thing for the Spurs to watch. I mean, it says a lot about his character and his confidence and his, his guts. Really, I mean, he's been the guy that has been the steadying force of the Spurs when they needed it. And really, if you look at game two, the Spurs built their second 19-point lead. White was in the middle of that. He was on the floor, and then as the collapse happened, as that started to whittle away, that coincided with a time where Derek White was on the bench getting a rest. I mean, he's been a very important part of this team for a long time, and I just think. Watching him in his playoffs has been eye-opening. He's averaged 16.5 points over the first couple of games. He's shooting the lights out. I think he's 14 of 21. Turnovers are a little high, which I think you expect from a point guard, really making his first two NBA playoff appearances that count. But other than that, I mean, I think what you're seeing. I mean, if he doesn't show up this way, then I don't know. The Spurs don't have a chance in the series. I mean, the NBA playoff series these days are basically dictated by guard play, and if Derek White doesn't show up and counter Jamal Murray, then the Spurs are sunk. And I just think he's been a really, really important part of what they've done, and the fact that he's not scared of the moment, I think, is the really, really heartening thing about what he's done. I mean, in game one, everyone's going to remember his big dunk over Paul Millsap, his steal to seal the game, and game two he was pretty much just as good. The rest of the Spurs just kind of didn't pull their weight in that game.
Man, you're really pulling the punches here today, Jeff. This is great listening to all this commentary. Take note, rest of the Spurs team. So speaking of the players, of course, we got all-stars on both sides. We've already talked about White. We've talked about Murray. But, I'm talking about Jokic. I'm talking about Aldridge, DeRozan. They've all had their moments so far in these first two games. Is there an X-factor type player for each team where the performance could really tilt the series one way or the other? Obviously, you just got done talking about Derek White. Before then, we talked about Jamal Murray. But what about the other big stars?
Yeah, a lot of focus in the series is going to be on the, as you mentioned, the all-stars, the guys with the bigger names. Nikola Jokic, who's been pretty great for Denver, had a triple-double in game one, had a near triple-double in game two. DeMar DeRozan had 31 points in game two. LaMarcus Aldridge had 24 in game two. But a lot of times these series are kind of a combination of what your stars do and can somebody else step up to give you kind of a punch that you're not expecting. And I think, you're looking at, for Denver, it's, there's maybe one or two guys I would single out there. I mean, they have a lot of guys who could play better, who could lift you. But I look at what their bench is doing, and it hasn't been, at times it hasn't been much. And Denver needs its bench to be really good. And so I think one of the guys you're looking for to be an X factor on their side is Malik Beasley. He's a guy that has kind of been the scoring punch off their bench, and he's been there at times in this series, but they probably need him to be there a little more often. And another guy I'd mentioned for them that we saw in game two is Paul Millsap. Paul Millsap, on a team that, as we've mentioned, has no playoff experience or very little playoff experience to speak of. Paul Millsap is a guy that's played 80-something NBA playoff games before this year. He's kind of their entire reserve of playoff moxie, and he had a 20-point game in game two and is really important, and he's been really important defending the guy that I would call the Spurs X factor, and that's Rudy Gay. they've moved Rudy Gay to the bench. He's supposed to be sort of the bench scoring punch for the Spurs. They like keeping him at times away from DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge, so there's more shots to go around. So they bring him off the bench so he can kind of have free reign to score. And in the first game, I thought he was really good. He had a big second quarter, ended with 14 points, and I thought he was a big reason the Spurs were able to take game one. He was pretty much a no-show in game two. He had 5 points. He missed 7 of his 9 shots. He had a couple of pretty crucial turnovers. And this is a veteran guy that, the Spurs are counting on to really be the anchor of their bench. So I think if everything else goes the way it has gone so far for the Spurs and Rudy Gay plays well, then I think that gives them a better that bodes well for their chances of winning games and winning the series.
And then finally here, Jeff, I'm going to let you go, but I want to get your thoughts on the rest of the series. And also at a time when Greg Popovich, I got to make sure I say this correctly because I always trip up on this wording, the winningest, that's a word, coach in NBA history. There was a tie for 3 days, but now it's Greg Popovich. That being the case, everything that you've already just mentioned so far in today's discussion, what are you thinking for this series? Tom Orsborn was on last week. I appreciated his honesty. He said Denver in 7. What do you think?
Going into the series, I predicted Denver in 7, and I guess we are still sort of on track where that could happen. I mean, this is probably no grand analysis, but I think the next 2 games will probably be telling. I think if the Spurs win both the games at home and take that 3-1 lead, I think they're winning the series. And I know that doesn't sound like going on a very steep limb, but I also think if they lose one of the 2, if they're going back to Denver tied, I'm going to give Denver the edge. I think. I think coming in, we were, like I mentioned earlier, we were wondering, can the Spurs win 1 game on the road in this series? Like that was going to be a tall task, and then they did it. I think it's a tall ask to ask a team to win 2 games on the road in a playoff series when they just haven't been a good road team. Before the playoffs, they hadn't beaten a Western Conference team on the road since December. So it's hard to ask them to do that twice in the span of 7 games. So I think if the Spurs can win the 2 at home, then they set themselves up. I don't think Denver comes back from that. But I think if you allow Denver to regain home court advantage, where all they have to do is win 2 of 3 on their, 2 of the next 3, and 2 of them are on their own floor, I think the edge swings back to Denver pretty wildly in that case.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News sports writer Jeff McDonald for joining me for today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.